So what I want to do really is give a quick skim through what was a very large and kind of all-encompassing project that took a lot of my life for the last 4.5 years or so. And I want to keep it really quite simple and I hope as entertaining as I can. I want to talk about what this thing was that we called Atlas, why the Atlantic Ocean is important, why oceans matter, and what it is we actually did. Just really a few reflections, a few key results and highlights, and then a forward look to where this kind of research is going at the University of Edinburgh. Atlas was coordinated here in Edinburgh. We have a new project again in the Atlantic called Atlantic. I'll talk to you about that. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about why oceans are so much on the agenda at the moment. So if we start, then this is, of course, any marine scientist's favorite view of the Earth, because it isn't the Earth. It's Arthur C. Clarke reminds us, it's planet ocean, for all the obvious reasons. I mean, even really, really well-educated people are not aware that it's the oceans that have absorbed over 90% of global heating. Okay, so without the oceans, imagine what runaway global warming we would be experiencing. They clearly mitigate and modulate the Earth's climate in many complicated ways. Ocean phytoplankton have produced a huge proportion of the oxygen in the atmosphere that we rely on. The oceans have absorbed about a third of the carbon dioxide released since we industrialized. So they are enormously vitally important and have been thought to be too big to really ever suffer any consequences. But I think that has changed. It has now become very clear that the oceans are indeed vulnerable. They are highly interconnected spaces. Atlas was a North Atlantic basin scale project, so very much used that as one of its foundational aspects. And the rates of change we see in the ocean are really off track now. They're so fast compared to anything in the geological period. Atlas was a project funded at the entire basin scale, right, from east to west across the North Atlantic Ocean. And it's really working at that scale that's needed now to inform policy so that we can develop the right management strategies moving forward. That's really what Atlas was all about. So to set our frame and think about that highly connected space, here is the global ocean. It's one ocean, of course. We divide it into areas we might call the Atlantic or Pacific or whatever it may be, but it's one interconnected space. The thermohaline circulation transports heat, and we have this movement of water across the surface of the planet. A key thing here is just to remember how important that is. Think of the heat transfer from equatorial regions through the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic currents that keep Scotland, Europe, the relatively mild and pleasant temperatures we enjoy here compared to the similar latitudes over in Canada. Well, as that heat's exchanged, those warmer waters cool, they become denser, they sink and they overturn, and they then return at depth. Now, that very process, interconnecting through the thermohaline circulation of the ocean, means that as we add more CO2 into the system, through that circulation, that relatively warmer, CO2-rich and oxygen-poor water is dispersed around the global ocean. Massive concern about the implications of that. Now, overriding and in addition to the implications of any changes in thermohaline circulation or the chemistry and the temperature of the oceans are the things that we do as people. So here is just a roll call of some of the horror shows, really, of where human activities in the oceans go horribly wrong or are very poorly controlled. From the occasional and tragic accidents we see, this is a Deepwater Horizon accident in the Gulf of Mexico and the subsequent oil spill, through to the implications of oiling on certain seabirds, the devastating effects actually of seabed bottom fishing. This is a very destructive way of catching food, which across the world has really altered seabed ecosystems. We have rapid development of the coastal zone, the spread of aquaculture into areas where aquaculture was never present. And then in the future, the prospect here, if you can see my cursor, of mining the deep ocean, areas of the ocean that have never experienced direct human pressures are now potentially to be mined for rare earth elements and other critical minerals. So I like to look at this in a way as the four horsemen of the apocalypse that the oceans are facing. We have destructive human uses, that's horseman one. The oceans are warming at this unprecedented rate, horseman two. The third horseman, acidification. You load that much more CO2 into the system, the very pH of the global ocean is declining. It isn't going to become an acidic solution for sure, but it's moving in that direction. We use the term ocean acidification. This warmer seawater can hold less oxygen. We're seeing the spread of oxygen minimum zones across vast areas of the global ocean now. So these are the four horsemen that there is so much concern about. And Atlas was in part created to address these concerns. There is indeed a title behind the acronym, a Transatlantic Assessment and Deep Water Ecosystem-Based Spatial Management Plan for Europe. I think I'm maybe one of the few people that know the title underlying Atlas. What in essence we were doing was responding to a call from the European Union that came out in 2013-14 to unlock the potential of seas and create the robust management, the science that would allow really robust management moving forward. Now, we decided to focus on the deep ocean and the seabed ecosystems of the deep ocean because those were the areas about which we understood the least, and there are also those that need a basin scale management approach. So this graphic tries to just illustrate the breadth of the consortium, the scale of the funding. I put these money bags here because this is quite significant. The funds came from the European Union, yet we were mandated through a transatlantic partnership to work with Canadians and Americans who didn't have any money. So that had to bring a lot of kind of creative thinking, how we'd share resources, share expertise, share people in order to access ships and so forth from North America. We made good progress there. This graphic also shows you those major overturning circulation paths. Here, the Gulf Stream, North Atlantic Drift, and up into the Arctic, and there the overturning cooler waters coming back at depth. And in white, I put on the positions of instruments that span the Atlantic, like beads on a chain across these critical areas of that overturning circulation. The marine physics community had already instrumented the Atlantic. So projects like Atlas could come in, buy new sensors, enhance the capacity, particularly in this region of the overturning subpolar North Atlantic portion of the array. So we did a lot of work in that area. We had 24 partners, something called a linked third party. Those of you that are into EU projects, that's the Canadian government. Governments don't sign, other entities, grant agreements and so forth. So they linked to us as a third party, but did an amazing piece of work for Atlas. The Canadians were heavily involved. So let me now tell you a little bit about what the project actually did. So we were a project looking at deep sea ecosystems. These are the structural ecosystems of the deep ocean, from deep corals through coral gardens to chemosynthetic communities here to sponge grounds. So these were our focal areas. Now, these structural habitats are inherently vulnerable. Here are the damage caused by bottom trawling to deep water coral mounds off Norway, areas here in untrawled regions and areas here damaged by trawling. And that concern led to these ecosystems being elevated up the international agenda. Through the United Nations, they're recognized by organizations like FAO as being vulnerable marine ecosystems. That brings with it mandates for their protection. And this was something that Atlas had to work with and to enhance. This policy side was equally, in parallel to any scientific planning. The policy planning was equally prominent. So as we developed the project, we came up with 4 simple overall objectives, that Atlas would work within to advance our basic understanding of how these ecosystems function, to then use that understanding to improve our capacity to model and predict shifts in time. So if we're going to see these rapid changes in pH, in circulation strength, well, what does that mean to the functioning of the systems? How do we use that information to create new tools that we can pull straight through to policy and governance? And then the final thing Europe challenged us to do, how can that be used in really robust management strategies in the future? Now, Atlas has already published over 100 papers. We're on track by probably next year to have published 200. We summarize this in a compendium of results you can find online. You're really welcome to contact us if you'd like copies. I can't go into all the results, but I want to tell you a few of the results and think about how the project worked. Advisory boards and policy interface were critical to what we did. So we worked very closely with industry. The oil industry is really the biggest sector active in the deep ocean at the moment. So we partnered with individual companies. We worked with their data, with their challenges around impact assessment. We worked also with fisheries, but it tended to be through science policy panels because the fishery management organizations always want to be at one step removed from active science discovery. Often information is fed through organizations like the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. In the policy space, a development I'll talk about later is an ongoing negotiation at the UN of an internationally legally binding agreement to manage biodiversity in areas outside nations' jurisdiction. Now, this negotiation is still ongoing, and Atlas attended both the preparatory committees and the negotiation sessions in New York. That was a huge opportunity for us. I always name check our advisory board chair, Jake Rice, a hugely influential Canadian fisheries scientist, now retired, who chaired our board. So to give you a quick flavour of some of the findings, this is how we constructed the project. Okay, so any piece of our jigsaw, take one out and the whole thing fails. And this just gives a really simple overview of the scientific aspects, the networking aspects, the policy and communications aspects that were needed to make Atlas work. So it was genuinely a multidisciplinary approach, which fed through to socioeconomic analyses of how we value ecosystems and their services. I can't talk too much about that. I don't really have enough time, but really interesting results came from that study. And all of the work sat at the science policy interface. So even the details, I'll talk to some of you a little bit about these ocean circulation results we found. Even these quite scientific findings, work published in Nature and Science during the course of Atlas by David Thornalley and others. We took this information into the UN and we showed people that what were really stark results, that not only is the overturning circulation slowing, but it's already anomalously weak, probably weaker than it's been for the last 1600 years. Now, those of you who reading the papers last week may have seen yet more compilations of this kind of work, including David Thornalley's group, showing that the circulation strength indeed is very, very much slower than we thought and slowing. So this is a tremendously significant finding. What this means in terms of ecosystem function is a very, very major concern. It's altering fish stocks and their abundance and their location already. Another example in terms of results from Atlas, how do we assess carbon flow? I want to give you two examples. One around how important food flux, the transfer of food from the surface to the deep sea is, and how important it is to understand that, and what the trajectories and the future holds for some of these ecosystems. So here I'm showing you a graphic from Carleen Souter's work, where she modeled how coral mounds, which themselves are biologically generative. So corals grow, they trap sediments, they create mounds off the seafloor. These mounds grow up over time. And in model simulations, you can see they're even drawing down organic matter to the detriment, actually, of areas off the mound. So this was a really interesting finding. We see this, we back this up now with in situ observations. So a really enhanced, topographically enhanced carbon pump. So we know much more about how those places function now. And looking to the future, Atlas did a lot of work about the future trajectories of these places. When we look at the climate impacts on the deep sea, I've already trailed this, we see very significant increases in temperature. Now remember, the abyss does not change much. This is a very quiescent environment. So a 1 degree temperature change over the next century is huge. Declining oxygen, declining particulate organic carbon, think food flux. Now, when some areas of the abyss only receive the equivalent of 1 sugar cube per year of food, if we take that down by a half, it's staggering to think what the implications will be. The animals that live there currently really won't be able to live there in the future. And we see this decline in pH. When we look at that decline in pH, the acidification, and we look at corals which build their skeletons from calcium carbonate, we see pitting, erosion, and even osteoporosis of the coral skeletons. And it's those coral skeletons, remember, that form the mounds that draw the food down. It's all this biological engineering which is imperiled if we lose the structure. And the habitat provision from that structure is also lost extremely rapidly. So moving on to a few other findings, there's an awful lot I could tell you about biodiversity, but I'm just going to look at one of the projected models, pieces of work that came out in Global Change Biology. This piece of work used all of the climate scenarios that Atlas had investigated and then asked the question, well, in the future ocean, how suitable is the habitat? Now, I'm afraid for the corals, it's not good news. We also looked at fish, and we saw good evidence that fish will be moving from one place to the other, and we made some observations that that was indeed happening. But if we look at the suitability of the habitat, some of the areas that I'll show you pictures of later that are highly suitable for these corals off Scotland and Ireland are becoming extremely low in their suitability index. And the Atlantic is the global hotspot for these species. So we're sadly going to see a degradation in these habitats, and I think that's now going to happen. So it's all about how we limit additional pressures on these systems moving forward. And a big part of that's bringing people along with you at all points. So we put a vast energy into that in Atlas. We needed people to understand deep Atlantic ecosystems, and not just people like me or my kids or my family, but people that have no real interest or maybe familiarity with marine biology or the deep ocean. So we partnered with Dynamic Earth and specialists like AquaTT in Ireland to create educational and outreach materials which are now used Dynamic Earth and will be used into the future. They've even leveraged a Heritage Lottery Fund to redevelop their Oceans Gallery, slightly delayed by COVID, but this will be opening in the next year or so from the Challenger through to the present day, and Atlas will be used in this present day exhibit at Dynamic Earth. So we really had a fantastic time working with Dynamic Earth, and I wish I could show you more of the materials. Lots of information is on our website. Now, in terms of policy, I want to give a few examples and again point you to a synthetic report where you can read a few of the details. There's, in good European project terms, a 100-page deliverable that underlies this. This is just the summary glossy report. But just to show you some of the findings that came together, David Johnson led our policy work, an extremely competent policy specialist who was the executive secretary of OSPAR, a convention that manages actually activities in the North Atlantic and the environmental components of that. And David reflected on all the area-based management tools, all the protected areas and so forth that span the Atlantic. And really none of them will be meeting their objectives by the end of the century. Only this one hydrothermal vent field will be meeting its conservation and management objectives. It's pretty stark. So as the detail comes in, David's projections and those of Atlas are looking to be pretty accurate. In fact, they might even be rather conservative. A couple of other examples of Atlas in action in the policy sphere. This is David with Christine Gable, who's just going to soon be starting a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. This is the late Biljana Cecin and myself at the UN, where we ran a whole series of side events, taking this Atlas work right into those people negotiating that new internationally legally binding agreement. Here's an example, BBNJ, that's biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, capacity development in the context of climate change. So we took David Thornalley's results, we took the concerns of habitat suitability and the uncertain future for animals like deep water corals into the UN. We reflected also on how important was science in that negotiation. Christine has just recently published a paper on this and will be following up through her PhD. So look out, please, for more on that. It's a really important development, one that gets very little public attention, but the UN doesn't meet to revise its international oceans treaties very often. Once in 30 to 50 years would this happen. It was very fortunate that Atlas was happening as that took place. We also contributed to the Convention on Biological Diversity's work to describe ecologically or biologically significant marine areas. I've highlighted here one example where Atlas went right from discovery and characterization of seamount ecosystems through to submitting an EBSA template. That was ratified at a workshop in Sweden and will soon be considered by the Conference of the Parties. So from discovery through scientific publication through to, we hope, ratification by Conference of the Parties. We also contributed to these other areas in the Atlantic. It was an amazing part of the project, this, and one that we all enjoyed very much. And we engaged students right from the outset. Christine's a great example. She worked on us through our Marine Systems and Policies master's program. She was a student on that program. This work was led by Berta Ramiro Sanchez, who was an Atlas PhD student also here at the University of Edinburgh. She's now a postdoc over in France. So this is my gallop through Atlas, and I'm going to show you a quick video in a second and then have this forward look. But I thought I'd just throw a few points up about kind of the challenges of this sort of work, to be honest. I think my take homes on projects like Atlas, which are really big and extremely challenging, actually, to try and keep on track. Things change in research all the time. And if your research is on a ship on the Atlantic with a complex partnership where there's no funding changing hands, there's many things that can go wrong. So it's a continual process of rebalancing and reorganization. But my take homes would be to engage in all of that early, including policy and industry. Don't do it late, do it right from the start, even before you start formulating a science plan. Set a very clear course, be serious about co-design and diverse knowledge systems. Don't forget industry has a huge amount of knowledge. In many areas, certainly in marine science, local and indigenous communities hold huge amounts of information that's often forgotten. It really shouldn't be. Adapt to policy change quickly. And if things challenge and look like they're going to be problems, realize it early on and get on with sorting it out. There's lots of ways of sorting out issues and being creative, even in the context of something as controlled and riddled with red tape as an EU project. Detail is vital, and continual rebalancing is vital. And then I think finally, it really is all about this last point, that there's an amazing team that comes together in these bigger projects. I mean, Atlas had around 100 investigators. I think in our last submission, we logged 140 investigators into the work. So it's a big team to be looking after, but there's a lot of fun within that. And you can see this compilation that we pulled together showing Atlas in action. People really engaged with this project and they loved the experience. And I think that's what really helped us follow it all through. So what I want to do now is do a risky thing and try and show a video. I'm aware that the resolution might not be super brilliant across Teams, so I apologize for that. If it doesn't work, you can find this on the Atlas Twitter feed.
Today we're going to be exploring the deep sea and finding out what it's like to work on board and research it. So are we all up for exploring the sea today? Can you give us a cheer?
So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour of the work in Atlas and everybody that was involved behind the project. What I want to do now, just for the last couple of minutes, is take a quick forward look. So Atlas ran between 2016 and 2020. And here I put the Galway Statement, this transatlantic statement on cooperation across the Atlantic I mentioned earlier. And this political declaration was really important in us pulling our thoughts together and our team together. As we move forward, there's a similar declaration for our new project, Atlantic. But one thing I often note in talks like this, a great report came out in 2017 from IOC UNESCO, the Global Ocean Science Report of 2017, and it looked at the number of papers coming out across the world and the number of citations scaled by geography. And really this map is horrifying because, I suppose unsurprisingly, we see the dominance of the North and the complete disparity of capability in the South. And this has to change, and it has to change fast. What's so good about projects like Atlantic, which are mandated by the Belém Statement on a cooperation across the whole Atlantic, is that we can now send funds from Europe to South Africa and to Brazil, and in the case of Atlantic, to Argentina. So we're working very hard on enhancing and sharing expertise in as many ways as we can. So certainly ships and technologies move from north to south, but expertise from Central and South America in the taxonomy and identification of marine species, which is highly advanced in South America. We want that here in Europe, and we want this in flowing into North America. So we're very careful to balance that information exchange. So Atlantic, as we move forward, we launched in 2019, we run till the end of 2023. It's a project that encompasses these regional areas from 1 through till 12 across the whole ocean basin. I can't give you the details, there isn't time today, but we're active, we're ongoing, we're operating. I'm the coordinator. Here's the team of organizations right across the Atlantic basin, north, east, south, and west. One of the things we're proudest about in this project is the community of earlier career researchers that we've assembled. So we now have 46 iAtlantic fellows. Several are at University of Edinburgh, and they are right across the Atlantic basin. And we have a very active webinar series that they've actually initiated and a capacity building program. This project is so challenging, it's running through the COVID era. Very, very much harder to build a team the same way that we built the team in Atlas, but we're doing the best that we can in the online environment that we now inhabit. Lots more details on iAtlantic on the website. If there's chance in discussion, we can chat some more perhaps about what the project is all about. So I'll end really with this thought. Oceans are on the agenda right now, really as they've never ever been before. Last year was meant to be the ocean super year. We're now calling this year the ocean super year because really 2020 was a lost year for so many obvious reasons. But this is the year of COP26. This is the year when the impacts of the climate strikes, the awareness of extinction, the concern over the environmental crisis has really reached a zenith. So I think we now need to do all we can to take advantage of what this new wave is bringing. This year is Scotland's Year of Coasts and Waters. IPCC remain active, and this was a seminal report from 2019, the special report on the oceans and cryosphere. As I say, COP26 is an incredibly important opportunity, and we have a number of activities now submitted to the Green Zone at COP, and Edinburgh University is accredited to send a few people into the negotiations as well, into the Blue Zone of COP26. There's a lot that we must do there to enhance awareness of the importance of the ocean climate nexus and the sustainability of our activities in the ocean. And I think the future trajectory is promising. We're entering a decade of ecosystem restoration at the UN level and a very active decade of ocean science for sustainable development. I'm pleased to say the university is at the heart of these things. We are a partner, an agreed partner in the UN Ocean Decade moving forward. And we want to see the university have a central role in these initiatives and opportunities moving forward. One quick example that I'll give you before we close of a new partnership that is important in this. And we have, over the last year, negotiated a 5-year collaborative partnership with a marine station in the village of St Abbs on the Berwickshire coast. This is a really interesting facility. Check their website. I'll give you the link in a second. It was built entirely of non-ferrous materials. They've been researching the impacts of electromagnetic fields from marine renewable energy devices on marine organisms, one of the only facilities in the world with the right built environment and the right expertise to do that. Now we are their collaborating partner. We're joining together over the next 5 years. If you're interested, contact me. I'd be very happy to connect you with people in St Abbs. And we can start working on that together. So I think that's everything that I had to say today. I wanted to thank you all so much for listening. It's hard to be on yet another Teams call, especially over your lunch break. Here are some web links and so forth to the projects that I mentioned. And one that was only in the bottom of one of my slides is the One Ocean Hub. This is a GCRF hub that I'm a partner in. It's led from the University of Strathclyde. Also a really interesting one to watch in terms of how it's taking local communities and the social aspects of ocean science right from the outset, and then developing a very carefully formulated plan around ocean sustainability and policy engagement.